for coming. If you're not super familiar with Product Tank, it's just an informal meetup for product managers where we talk about things related to product. And part of that is we like to interview experts just to get their insights and stories. And tonight, our guest expert is Nick Anderson, who is a director of product over at CoverMyMeds. So we're super excited to just talk to him. This is going to be super informal, casual conversation, but just to get some of his story, experiences, and insights. But Nick, welcome, man. It's good to have you.
Yeah, it's good to be here. I think call me an expert, setting a high bar there, Lucas.
Well, tonight we will be considering you the expert. And yeah, man. So I guess just to start out, for folks that are curious, like, how did you sort of get into the world of product?
Yeah, it was sort of a circuitous route. I started in implementation. Working for a software company. It was a healthcare IT company called Epic Systems, and went in, did basically project management work, but it was project management plus like configuration and solving customer problems and trying to take those back to the development teams so they could learn and build new capabilities. And I went from there to another company called Highland Software, where I did basically the same thing. I was doing project management, but it was still sort of at that point in time an emerging offering in healthcare, and there was a lot of unmet needs. And so it was going back to the development team, working with that development team to figure out if we made a couple of tweaks or adjustments, we could really solve customers' problems better. Working with the tools we had and capabilities to kind of configure them in interesting or unique ways to again solve those problems. And so sort of that kind of repetitive, being a little bit early in a market, being in that implementation role where I'm directly interfacing with that customer. And so I got a lot of that background in those roles. And then again, moved on into CoverMyMeds, again, focused on really project management. And then once I got to CoverMyMeds, that was 6 years ago. The project management or product management was still sort of new, at least here in the Midwest, at least in CoverMyMeds. And so there was sort of a gradual move in my role, from being a project manager to being more of a kind of solution consultant, into being more of the product owner, and then eventually into product management itself as the discipline inside CoverMyMeds became kind of more thought out and more robust. And so really it was that sort of trajectory arc of project management evolving into product management.
Yeah, it's interesting, and people come into product from all different backgrounds, as I frequently say. And I guess so for you, having moved kind of into that, more into product directly, what do you think it is about product specifically that I guess gets you interested or excited?
Yeah, I think what I maybe enjoy most is, again, I think in my last answer, I sort of talked about the problem solving. Like, I like solving problems. I like helping customers feel like there isn't a solution in the market for them, and then delivering something that then they come back and say, this just not only solved our problem, but we want you to help us solve some other problems now. And so I think what product management does is it gives us a set of tools and a way of thinking that makes that a more successful journey, right? I think especially early on in my career, I wasn't thinking about it in a disciplined way. It was just, oh, I could do this or we could do that. And sometimes it worked, sometimes it failed spectacularly. Sometimes there were promises that could get made, and then you couldn't really follow through because you didn't understand the limitations. And you did it more in a waterfall way where you had your development team build what you thought they needed. And so what I really liked about as I moved into product was really it's understanding, it's that framework for understanding a customer's problems. It's when you pair it with Agile, it becomes a way to solve their problems in a more meaningful way, in a way that you're going to have a higher rate of success. And so, that's what really kind of gets me excited about it is being able to address those problems.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think before I get too far into it too, I know that probably a lot of folks have heard about Cover My Meds, and I wouldn't be surprised if most people on the call know something about it. But uh, perhaps just tell us like a little bit about kind of like Cover My Meds and like sort of what your focus is over there.
Sure. Probably should have started there. Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, no,
Gonna
that's
jump
on the
right in.
interviewer. That's on me, not you.
Yeah, so I guess if you're not familiar with CoverMyMeds, it started around 10 years ago, and it's been primarily focused on solving and helping providers more effectively complete what's called a prior authorization form, which is basically the form, the document that the insurance companies often ask providers, doctors, nurses to fill out to sort of explain why they think a course of treatment is going to be best for a patient. And that helps the insurance company determine, should we pay for this? Is there maybe, something else, a different treatment that would be better for this patient? And it helps them kind of gauge kind of with the doctor, be part of that care plan. And so the automation of prior authorization forms was where CoverMyMeds, saw an emerging market about 10 years ago and has really built itself on top of that. That has been the main driver of its success. They're a huge pain point for providers, so there's a huge need in the market for streamlining and automating those forms. You can imagine on the insurance side, in taking those forms and transcribing them from paper was a massive resource drain. And so we also then help those insurance companies kind of automate their evaluations and the flow of those forms inside their organizations. And so that's where CoverMyMeds got its start. It's where CoverMyMeds has been focused to date. But we're also, I think, as an organization, our mission is to help people get the medications they need to lead healthy lives. And so PA was the first place we focused. And now as an organization, we're really trying to grow into more broad medication access problems. So PA being one of the biggest ones, but there's other reasons why patients can't get on therapy. And so we're looking at how can we help solve those problems, both once they're encountered, how do we solve those problems for providers and patients before they even happen. And so my role in the organization, I think you introduced me as a director of product, and that's really my official title. But I would actually say I'm more of a director of product delivery. I have a couple product managers who report to me. I have an engineering team that reports to me and an analytics team. I also, there's a clinical pharmacist mixed in there as well. And so that team together works with me to help solve some of those problems. We're very focused on helping provide physicians and nurses information early in the process, things like cost of medication, in order to help them make the best choices for their patients. But that's where my team is focused. And it's really, I think in the past I've worked and been a director of just product management. I think it's really kind of fulfilling to be able to lead a broad kind of polydiscipline team.
Yeah.
There's each group has its own perspectives, and to be able to help coordinate and kind of stitch it all together is pretty fulfilling.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for that. I think there's a lot there, and it, it, I think there's a lot of different aspects to the product management, especially with around delivery. Like you and I talked, we're talking before. I think actually I want to start with like just the idea of like Cover My Meds has become this massive sort of organization, right? I can't remember, but I think you said there's like 1,000 some employees there now.
Yeah, the Columbus-based CoverMyMeds is over 1,500 employees.
1,500.
Yeah.
So, just from a like a team standpoint, I think it's interesting to think about, you know, how how do they make choices around like what constitutes a product team and like how do you kind of make an effective product team in your view?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know that I have a definitive answer for all of
Hmm.
CoverMyMeds.
Yeah.
I think we talked about this a little bit. I think one of the interesting things about CoverMyMeds that I see is different from how other organizations often practice product management is there isn't necessarily like a centralized chief product officer. In a lot of companies, there is a singular person who is got that title of VP of product, title of chief product officer. At CoverMyMeds, there's more product within business units. And what stitches and makes it cohesive is we do a lot of planning as a group, as a leadership team. We do obviously annual strategic planning, but we're kind of constantly kind of engaging and evaluating that strategy, the approaches. We're setting common goals across the whole company, and so those sort of become our guiding KPIs, if you will, and our kind of, I guess, OKRs is the term a lot of organizations like to use, although that's not necessarily what we would call them. And so within the kind of each unit, the groups get to have a lot of leniency around how they decide to form. And that's informed a little bit by the business leader over that business unit. And it's also informed by the product team. My team was kind of spun out of a couple business units 2 years ago. And so people were able to kind of select into it. And there was a group of us that sort of discussed what types of people and roles we needed and where we could get those individuals from. And so we were able to kind of organically say, this is what we need for success for this sort of solution and these sorts of problems that we're solving. And so we established our own, I guess, path in that way.
Do you think there's any kind of cap that makes sense around a product team in terms of just like size?
Yeah, I do think that there's probably limits, right? Even within business units, there's products, right, and individual things that we would consider products or key pieces of infrastructure that we kind of organize around. And so I do think that there are limits. You read about, like, I think the 2 pizza rule at Amazon, Scrum 7 plus or minus 2. And I think that there's a lot of truth in a bunch of those numbers. I don't know that those are definitively finite, but I think the reasons that you have those are the same reasons I think that there probably is a cap to like what a singular team can do. And a lot of it comes down to kind of communication, and can people effectively understand what the other parts of the team are doing and coordinate well with each other. And the bigger you get, the harder that is, right? It's like, it's very easy to have 4 friends meet you for dinner, but when it comes, you have like 12 friends, now trying to coordinate everybody's schedules, understanding who's coming when, and when people are leaving and what dietary restrictions there are, all of that just becomes so much more complicated, right? And I think, that's kind of a silly example, but it's, I think, very similar when you're doing product development. If you can't all just kind of get in a room, if you can't generally all know where each other is, I think it creates communication breakdowns that then start to make you de facto start creating individual product teams, right? You start getting certain people who want to specialize in certain areas. John and Nick are always the ones working over here. Bob and Sam are always over there. And so I think the teams start to essentially split themselves, and you're creating more conflict by trying to force them together.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and I'll have to remember that 2 pizza rule. That's interesting. Um, one thing you mentioned is sort of just like the coordination and communication piece, and I'm curious too, kind of also having been through a pretty crazy year and a half, like how are you kind of coordinating communication and managing the team? Is it all like remote, or like how are you kind of keeping everybody together and cohesive?
Yeah. This past year, it's all been remote. We've been remote since last March. We are just now beginning to kind of pilot some back to office, return to office strategies, but really it's almost been a little bit easier, I think, with COVID, because my team at least was a hybrid team. And so there was definitely, I think, a little bit it wasn't an overriding concern, but a little bit of angst, over a year ago when there might be some conversations being had in the office, not intentionally, right? But they're just in office conversations, walking down the hall that other people weren't part of. And then some piece of knowledge was lost in, um, for some of the team. And so I think being fully remote, it's actually helped us be a little bit closer. And so the team does a number of different things to try to stay close. We want to have stand up every day. And we don't include just like the development team in stand up. It's the development team, it's the product team, the analysts, our UX researcher. Everybody shows up to talk about, if there's any roadblocks that they need to have happen, if there's what they're going to work on that day. And we decide for a given day what's the most important thing that we need to get done as a team. And then throughout the day, if people are just, we use Slack a lot, people will just start a Slack call. People can join those Slack calls to help them with work. And so it creates a very kind of collaborative day-to-day environment. We also, we do reviews weekly. So, I don't know that, I think we use the term sprint. I don't know that it's truly a sprint in the sense of a Scrum sprint, but our sprints are 1 week. And so we have reviews weekly where not only do we talk about what we did from a development standpoint, but we also talk about our business development team shows up and talks about the sales conversations they've had. Our implementation team shows up and talks about, new projects that have come up, concerns customers have had, and it helps kind of create just a continual dialogue. And then every 6 weeks or so, we try to do just like call it a state of the state, where we re-level set on what we're working on, why it's important, what are all the things that we've done over the past 6 weeks, because it's always just a shocking amount of work and things we've been able to accomplish. And where are we going in the next 6 weeks? And so between those different sorts of levels of granularity, I think it's kept the conversation and kept the transparency there for the team.
Yeah, that's awesome. So just kind of on the same vein of like communication and keeping things cohesive, one of the key things with any product manager is how you kind of incorporate the customer side of the equation and in terms of just like feedback and all of that. So I'd be curious to know just kind of like how you've been sort of interacting with customers and staying close to the customer throughout like the past year and a half.
Yeah, it's been difficult to stay as close with customers.
Hmm.
Before, we used to be able to go on site. We'd actually be able to go potentially into physicians' offices and see things implemented, get some of that direct customer feedback from the actual users, because our users aren't always our buyers in healthcare. And so we've lost some of that. We still make an effort to get on customer calls. We stay very close with our implementation team, especially as we're rolling out newer products and new features. We make sure that we try to always have developers on calls just to at least hear what's being talked about. And then we also, another component is just, we do have a user research team who's reaching out to people who use our software, or potentially people who just fit the profile of those that could use the software. And so we make sure that the whole product delivery team knows when those interviews are happening. They've got invites to listen in and potentially like suggest questions if they want to get involved. That UX team, our UX team often does readouts where after a set number of like interviews around a specific thing, they kind of summarize their findings, pull out key quotes. If they can do some quantitative analysis based on, do you prefer this screen or this screen? They kind of incorporate that as well to help give us some direction. And so I think the short story is it's been a little more piecemeal probably than what it was before, but I think we've been fairly effective at staying engaged.
Yeah. So one of the things you just mentioned is that it sounds like there's a lot of the different roles from the team that are included sort of in the customer like feedback process and like even like in the meetings with customers. So like especially as a product manager, like I feel like a lot of times you at least are on some level trying to translate what customers want into needs for sort of the product side of the team. But like, how do you guys approach that? Do you have all sorts of people kind of interfacing with the customer? Like, how much are you translating versus like how much are other people kind of like involved in collecting that feedback?
Yeah, I think there's always there's probably always some level of translation going to happen. Like you can't ever get completely rid of that. But what I like about my team is the developers often like to participate in those meetings, and I want them to participate. I want the different roles to sit on a call. I don't necessarily always need them to contribute. I think you and I talked about this a little bit. You know, depending on the role, we don't like have a pre-meeting, but quick Slack messages. This is what the call is going to be about. Here's what we're going to try to do, or we talk about it potentially during stand up in the morning. And so there's a little bit of a game plan going in, but just having them on the call to hear what the customer said, hear how they explained it, and then maybe afterwards being able to talk a little bit about, you know, how did I understand what they were saying versus how did the development team understand it? I think it adds a lot more context. And while it's, you know, I think in a lot of, I feel like I've read, you know, comments and on some of the kind of product Slack boards about, you know, do developers, you know, how much time should they spend doing these things versus those things? And I think it's not like sort of a false test, right? Like if they don't understand how I've translated it, we're going to end up in the wrong spot. It is saves us all so much more time and gets everybody more engaged if at least some members of the team have essentially heard it from essentially the horse's mouth, and we are all on the same page then. And if we didn't all understand what the customer ask was, we can go back to the customer then.
Uh, so one other thing you kind of touched on earlier in one of your other answers is the fact that CoverMyMeds is dealing with multiple stakeholders in terms of the sort of value that they're trying to provide. Like you've got the providers, the insurers, which I think those are separate, right? The providers are like the doctors and
Right.
physicians.
Yep.
So insurers, providers, and then the end customers or the people that benefit are the patients, right?
Right.
Um, so like when you're thinking about kind of designing a product or creating a product that's valuable to all of those, like how do you approach like thinking about value and like I don't know, like how do you think about creating something that's valuable to all of those? Because that's pretty challenging.
Yeah, I think it's very easy, and I've seen us, you know, not just at CoverMyMeds, but other organizations focus on one stakeholder or the other stakeholder. And the challenge really is if you do that, whatever you build is potentially not going to be want to be used by the other parts of the network that you need to build, right? And so the real challenge starts to become, can you do an assessment of what are the needs of, let's say, a provider? And they may have 5 or 6 different problem areas that you can identify through some surveys, you can identify through user interviews. A couple of those are probably in the realm of like medication access where we want to play. And so that starts to narrow that list. And then you have to do almost the exact same diligence on the other side and figure out, let's say for payers, what are their pain points? What are they trying to accomplish? What are their business goals? And then based on that, right? So one goal, you know, the providers want to streamline prior authorization. Payers don't want to process all that paperwork, right? And so how do you then take these two different sets of goals and start overlaying them across each other and seeing where is there a connection or a match? It doesn't necessarily have to be the biggest match out of the gate. And you don't necessarily have to build the solution that works best for both. But if you're going to go down that path, you need to know one of these, the path you're going on is going to lead to a point of intersection with the other one's problems. And I think finding that just takes time. It takes a lot of conversations and research from both angles, and then trying to overlay those against each other to see where is my kind of bridge between the two.
So for these different stakeholders that might have sort of different pain points, how do you kind of figure out, and I know that there's like a sort of a general answer to this, but like how do you figure out what is a real pain point? Like how do you think about it?
what is a real pain point.
Yeah, like a pain point, like versus just something that somebody says they want, but versus something that like they actually need.
Yeah. I mean, I guess on one hand, if they're bringing it up, then from their perspective, it is an actual pain point, right? I think it's more, is it a big enough pain point that more than one person have that pain point, right? Because you can build a solution that works for a person, but to build a product that is going to be wanted to be used repeatedly by multiple customers, you really need to start figuring out, does everybody have that pain point, or a good segment of people have that pain point? And so I think that really comes down to your user research, right? You can get customer feedback from a customer that they want a certain feature, but you need to decide as an organization or as a little product team, is that feature fit with the vision that you've laid out, or is it just a thing they're asking for? And then if it does, can you go to other customers and can they articulate the same pain point? Can you go to, if it's a consumer facing application, can you go out to that user segment and do a survey and confirm that, even if it's just a survey with 10 or 15 people, right? Can you get some other people from other organizations to say, yep, I do in fact have this same or a similar problem? Because then you can validate that that's actually a market problem and not just that the way that person has decided to do their work.
One question I have is, just in terms of like which customers to include, especially when you have so many different customers and such a big audience, like how do you kind of select like who should be in sort of the validation process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I have a solid answer to that.
Hmm.
Some of it comes down to, there are certain organizations, it's going to depend on your product. I think in my world, there's a lot of big organizations, right?
Hmm.
There's a number of payers, there's a number of electronic health record providers, there's a number of big health systems that we're working with. And depending on sort of your relationship with those people, depends on how willing they're going to be for you to keep coming back and asking them questions, right? And so there's some component of, I think, relationship management where you're trying to gauge, at least for in a business to business environment, where you're maybe more dependent on APIs, who are the customers I can go to that want to be innovative with me? Because not all customers are on an innovative, side of the curve. Some of them are, those latecomers to market, and they don't necessarily want to engage in those types of conversations. And so it's a little bit of just knowing who your customers are and knowing what your relationship is. I think when you're looking more for consumer facing applications, or applications that maybe you're selling to a business partner, but there's some kind of user that you can clearly identify using it, you can either go to your customers, or you can just go out and try to source people that match that profile. And so that becomes a little bit easier. And you just need to understand who is your typical user to start to get some of that market feedback.
So do you happen to also use like external kind of resources then?
Yeah, so our team does use some external resources. I think like user testing
Hmm.
is one that we use to help go out and find, especially if we're going to do a survey, they help us find people that match those profiles. But we also, we have a lot of users and we have relationships with them. At one point, we ran sort of like a little pop-up that just said, hey, do you want to participate? Would you be interested in participating in some follow-up surveys here? And so if people clicked in and said yes, we could use them as a way to do a different layer of research based on people who actually use the product.
Gotcha. So I kind of want to get your thoughts also around just some like methodological stuff like agile, like to what extent, and you mentioned earlier that you are incorporating agile, but I want to know kind of like how do you think about it with the teams there? Like, do you have a very strict adherence to sort of like an agile framework, or how is that kind of incorporated in what you do?
No, that's a good question. I think um, again, across CoverMyMeds, I can't answer for because again, each product delivery team has sort of come to their own conclusions. Scrum is very prevalent, or some form of Scrum. My own team uses it's some combination of Kanban and Scrum, right? And so what we did when we first formed was we kind of just sat in a room together and talked about what are the things that are important to us, like what are the principles that matter most, like delivering small increments of work was one of the, that's maybe not, it's a thing people talk about, but it's maybe not as important to some people, but for us on the scale of what makes us a tick, that was a very important component. And so that's why we decided, if it's small, then we should be able to do it in a week, which means we should be able to have a review in a week. And so we started to just look at what matters to us. What are the things we need to do as a team? We need to be able to report out to our stakeholders what we've done. So we have to have a review, right? And so we took parts and pieces of different methodologies that we'd seen used that aligned to our team's kind of internal philosophies, and then refined from there through kind of retrospectives. But the goal was always, how do we continually increment and make ourselves more agile? How do we be as process-less as possible? Because our team valued very little process. I think other teams at CoverMyMeds and other product teams that I've worked with they prefer a little bit more process, and they prefer a little bit more rigor. And so they've adopted different ways. But
that's interesting. So like, as far as like your preference around process versus non-process, like, I guess like what would make you sort of prefer one over the other, do you think?
I think it comes down to a little bit of like personal style and what makes you effective as a person, right? I think you know there's I don't know if you've done like Myers-Briggs or personalysis. There's all of those different kind of personality tests, but I think some of those, depending on where you fall in those different kind of personality mappings, some people, they really like to document everything. They like having firm lists, and other people prefer a little bit more ambiguity. They kind of prefer not knowing what they're going to work on in a week because they believe that there might be something more important for them to focus on, and they don't want to be too locked in on something. So depending on, again, just their working styles and personal just preference and innate what makes them tick. I think there's different styles of agile that work for different people and different teams more or less effectively.
It's kind of interesting too, because I feel like you're sort of hitting on, there's like the personality piece, and then you might also think like there's like a business piece too, with with especially like you mentioned, just being responsive to like a dynamic, like changing environment, like like kind of on the same like point you were just making about if it's super rigid and structured, maybe it's less responsive or something like that. So
yeah, I think that's a component, right? Is what do you need to optimize for to be successful in your organizational environment? So it's what works for you and your team, but also then what are the things that you have to deliver as a group that are kind of help meet the expectations of the business. And so, and that's not just like results, right? Everybody wants results, but it's also like how frequently do you get updates? How do you work with the sales team? And how does the sales team expect to get information from you? I think all of those things can play into your choice of agile methodology that you pick.
So just in terms of sort of being a product manager, I think product managers come from all different kinds of backgrounds and all different levels of technicality, and there's a range of ways people get into it. And I just want to know kind of like your sense of like, what do you think it makes somebody a good product manager?
mm,
It might be a hard one.
yeah, I think, I've worked with many different product managers who all have different styles. I think a common thread amongst the best is sort of a level of inquisitiveness, right? It's not enough for them just to hear that something is true. They want to know why it's true, right? And I think that leads to people who want be a little bit more data driven. It leads to people who don't want to just understand that this organization you're working with wants an API. Why do you want that API? What's the why behind the why, right? And so to me, I think to be a good product manager, you have to ask a lot of questions. You don't want to just understand what you think people want. You need to understand why they want it, potentially what their business model is, even if that doesn't seem directly applicable to your work, and just keep drilling into what makes that organization that you're working with or the customer that you're working, you're targeting, kind of tick, right? Because if you don't understand, if you don't kind of keep drilling down a couple levels, I think you can be a little too superficial in terms of both what you deliver, and also I think, when I am kind of coming back to like agile, with a lot of the methodologies, there's form and structure and ceremonies that you follow. But again, if you don't understand why you're doing those things, right, you're not going to maximize what you could get out of being in an agile framework. And so even in just the using your team's retrospective or similar sorts of reflection to say, why are we doing this? Is this really getting us where we need to go? I think just willingness to ask that question helps create a really solid product manager. It's what I would look for when hiring.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Also, I do want to open it up for folks to be able to ask questions. I know, like, especially the tech elevator people. I know you're coming in probably from like an early in the product career standpoint. Are there any questions you want to ask Nick about like just career product in general, or?
I actually have a question. You've already asked him some of it, Lucas, but I have a background in Bayesian statistics from a former life. So
Woo.
I was curious more about your user research that you do. You had mentioned that you do some surveys and that sort of thing, but I was curious to know what sort of techniques you use.
Oh, you're going to find me woefully not prepared to answer that.
No, it's fine.
I think in terms of like statistical analysis, I don't know that we put from a like survey standpoint tons of rigor behind like the statistics of it, right? We're asking a lot of questions a lot of times in our surveys around rank these things. Do you do this job function? If you had a choice between this and that, what do you prefer? And so it leads to, or it tends to lead to, an ability to kind of create these graphics and displays where you can see trends pretty clearly, but we're not necessarily, the sets of questions we're doing in those surveys, at least that I've done, they help kind of guide where we want to go in understanding our customer, but they're not, kind of deep rigor in terms of like trying to find and detect ongoing trends, right? Like most of our surveys, we have very specific goals or objectives we're trying to get to. And so the surveys kind of stand alone. And I think maybe some of the statistics would come into play more if we were doing some ongoing surveys of the very similar questions. So I'm afraid I don't have a good answer for you, other than
no, that is a good answer. Actually, but that's what you're using, so that's fine.
Yeah. I also, just on that, like doing new product development, oftentimes you may not have 1,000 customers to be able to interview to do like a statistically significant sample. You might, so there's a good mixture a lot of times of sort of like the surveys and then getting qualitative kind of feedback. And that is one of the challenges of sort of creating new products, is that sometimes that's not even available,
Yeah.
So
Yeah. I mean, I talked, I think a little bit earlier about, we start with, you've got on a two-sided market, you're trying to figure out what is the thing that's the overlap. And so one of the techniques we've used is sort of what you kind of described there, Lucas, is, we sent out a bunch of surveys with some vague questions based on kind of what we know about the space. And then based on that, we narrow in with qualitative interviews to validate and confirm and get better understanding as to what individuals and consumers are looking for. And then we go wide again with the survey, then you come back in again with qualitative, and you can kind of keep repeating that process to really start to narrow in on what are those pieces of value that customers would want, and understanding, could you impact them? And so that's, I think, to your point, we're not interviewing in those cases or surveying thousands. It's probably several hundred at a time. And so it's not, from a statistical significance standpoint, that may not be a thing.
No, that's fine. I'm curious to know, can you think of maybe something that you may have caught, or maybe where you went in a different direction, where you found some of the answers to be different than what you thought, and it actually changed the course of what you did in your product rollout?
Trying to think of an example that I could share.
It's funny too, because I imagine like this kind of stuff probably happens like so often that you're like, oh, which example do I pick?
Yeah, some of it in terms of like, the rollouts, again, I don't know that there's often not like a one answer, right? But you start to pick up these general trends. And so, I think some of the places where we've been surprised has been, who's actually making some decisions in a physician's office. One of the, I think, the surprises was there's a much higher rate of physician reliance on nurses and staff to at least tee up some of those choices than I think we would have initially guessed, right? Because those physicians are busy, they've got 15 minutes in a given room, they don't have time to do a lot of research. And so there's a reliance on other people to help them and augment them with that research. And so it's small insights like that. And then you can go, again, using that sort of go wide, come narrow approach, figure out, is that really a trend? What does that actually look like in practice? And is it something that we can engage with to help a patient?
Good stuff. Good question. Good answer. So Jamie, I know you're a product manager. I feel like we have to at least get one question from you.
Sure. I have plenty of questions for you.
Uh-oh.
Thank you for sharing things with me. And primarily, I'm a product manager over at Nationwide, so I'm certainly interested in hearing how you do it in other areas. So just had a couple questions around to see how they do it at CoverMyMeds, and then if you think that works well or that doesn't work well. So I guess starting out just from a planning perspective, I know you talked about you guys meeting together to define more annual type of goals, and then also meeting in like every 6 weeks to go through like it sounds like more of a near-term planning. As a product manager there, what's the expectation as far as how far out you're planning for your product? And then I guess, how do you substantiate that as far as like, are you creating 3-year plans or 1-year plans or just more near-term plans?
Yeah, I think from a annual and multi-annual perspective, it's less just me as like a product person, and it's more sort of a company-wide effort. It's the whole senior leadership team. It's the influencers that may be in other roles. It's engineering leadership. It's product leadership meeting together to again kind of collectively say, this is what's important. Here's the vision for this year. Here's the vision for fiscal years 21 through 25. And here's kind of just the overarching, like, this is where we need to march towards. goals. And so again, that happens annually with regular kind of check-ins throughout the year. I think CoverMyMeds is really great at trying to just honestly assess, are we on track or not on track? What will it take, if we're off track, to get on track? Do we want to do that, or should we pivot and focus somewhere else? And so it becomes like a living strategy instead of just fire and forget annually. In terms of like, where are we going with our individual products and the things that like my product delivery team owns, we have, again, sort of goals and metrics that are annually kind of set annually. We also, I think, try to meet quarterly and really dig in and say, what do we need to accomplish this quarter? Not just from a product delivery standpoint, but maybe from a sales goal, from an implementation standpoint, just from a, what do we know we don't know that we need to know in order to move forward in a quarter from now? And so we set out kind of higher level initiatives, and many of those tied to product delivery and things that we have to do. And so it helps us from a quarter by quarter basis say, are we on track towards meeting those annual goals? For my products themselves, we try to look at things in, I try to look again, kind of that 3-month window and say, and challenge my product managers to think about what are the maybe features or kind of key outcomes we think we're going to be able to do each month as we progress through this year. And then there's sort of a nebulous, here's the things for the future that may or may not come to pass depending on what we learn about the work we just did. If that worked really well, we may double down in a certain area and forget some of those, or we may learn that the business needs have shifted slightly, and so some of those future out items are not going to happen. And so it's a couple layers of granularity down from just outcomes, but it's not necessarily specifics. And then my team refines work weekly, or really as the cards get worked down. And so the planning is generally around, here's some of those key features that we just talked about needing to do this month and next month. Here's some of the work and chunks of work that have to happen for that to actually come to pass. And so then we start to plan the individual pieces of work almost ad hoc, right? As we see the opportunity to start executing against them. I don't know if that answered your question.
Oh, is he frozen?
He might be.
Jamie, I think you're frozen.
It did answer some of mine, I know, that I had. So as far as the planning and how you guys work, because we do 2-week sprints and that seems very fast, but a 1-week sprint, how do you keep all of that moving and have enough in your backlog to really kind of continue to keep that momentum going?
Yeah, that's I think I don't know that it's a complaint, but it's a common thing I hear from my product team is, crap, the backlog's empty again. We need to fill that back up. Or in our case, we have a ready column. And so, we sort of a hybrid model, right? It's not true Scrum, where in Scrum, you're pulling in, this is the work we're going to do over the next 2 weeks. And then the goal is to just get it done and be ready to refill. We act in how our workflow is more in a Kanban model, where we have a ready column. It has a certain number of cards that we allow to be in it. Once it gets below a certain threshold, we know it's time to have a refinement. And so instead of refinements being scheduled like every Wednesday, it's more, where are we in terms of the ready column? We've crossed the threshold. Let's get one scheduled. But it does, depending on how fast the team's moving, it does create a need to have a lot of refinements and a lot of cards. But what it also means is we don't spend tons of time prepping cards, right? The team is talking about the work that needs to happen, and that work is going to happen within probably a week, right? And so, in in past teams that I've worked on, we'd refine cards that wouldn't get worked for a month or 2 months. And the challenge with that was, do we even remember the context based on what we wrote on this card for what it really needs to happen? And now we're kind of swirling around having re-meeting to kind of confirm our understanding. The whole team is participating in a refinement. They know what this increment of work is, and it's a small piece of work because our goal is deliver it within a week of it being started. And so it's not huge. It's relatively small. We don't have to over document it. And so it allows us, to have those refinements and refine a number of cards relatively quickly. And that helps keep the velocity going. But it can be a challenge, especially in the healthcare world. There's things we have to run past third-party groups like legal, compliance. And if things are kind of stuck, or we weren't able to get the right people in a room at the right time, I know that there's challenges sometimes in getting that ready column filled up with at least some of the feature work. But I do think there's ebbs and flows of how ready are some of the things we're trying to do in terms of getting alignment and sign off. And my team does a really nice job of using some of those ebbs to do some of that, smaller tech debt work, right? Are all of our security patches up to date? Or do we need to do a couple of upgrades? And so the time is used well, regardless of what work we're doing. And it's just a kind of an ongoing dialogue with the product team around what can we be doing.
All right, good question, good answer. So any other questions?
I guess I had one other too, was that so we were attempting to transition to kind of a Scrum Agile, but for the product team themselves, it still feels we're very much have to get every single requirement, all UI, everything done for an entire feature ahead of time. And what would you suggest for ways to try to help our teams kind of transition away from that to more of an agile model throughout all of that?
Yeah,
So
I guess who wants all of that information up front? Is it the development team wants to know and see everything out of the gate so that they know?
Yeah, I think that it's more of we have a few development leaders that are very much like, no, I need to know the whole picture of everything, and I need to know what things are going to look like, and beforehand. Whereas some of our newer people and our offshore teams are very much used to working in Agile. They're like, okay, just keep throwing it at me. As long as I have a story map, I don't need as much information, And so we're trying to, so I just need to know kind of tips on how to try to help transition those that still really want to hang on to that, all of that documentation, and help start moving them towards more agile for across the board.
I think some of that is a little bit of like, what's the working style, right? Like they want that documentation for a reason, especially if what you're telling me is it's a leadership group versus the actual people who are doing it. They want that documentation to be comfortable, either with understanding what their people are doing. They're worried that about their team maybe not delivering something and then getting in trouble for it, or getting in trouble is the wrong word, right? Being blamed for some sort of delivery failure because they didn't have all the parts and pieces, right? And so I think if it's the leadership team that is wanting it, I think it's comes down to trying to be a conversation around why do you need it? Because it's probably a little bit defensive on their side. And so how can you help them, I think, mitigate what they believe could be the unintended consequences of not having that documentation, and then ensuring that they get the pieces that they need, and potentially it's more touch points and meetings and maybe even some, I don't want to say that it's like progress reports up from your side, but you need to find a different way to get them comfortable, right? Where you don't have to produce it all up front, but that ambiguity doesn't seem like a threat to them. And so that's what my impression just from what you
Yes.
described. Is
No, I think you hit the nail completely on the head there. Absolutely. Thank you.
Awesome. Just out of curiosity, we've got two Jamies, but the Jamie that just asked the question, where are you calling from?
I'm actually calling right now. I'm in Olentangy district down in Columbus, but
Okay.
I am, but no, the accent's from England, if that's what you're asking.
Okay. I wasn't sure if we had someone in England, physically in England at this moment in the product tank. And I was like, wow, that would be crazy. But okay. Columbus makes a lot more sense.
Yes.
You're going international, Lucas.
Hey, anyone we can get, but yeah, but thank you for the question. That was a good one. Now, other Jamie, you kind of got frozen there, but I think you had a second question that you didn't get to.
I did, which I think is a kind of connected to the question before about planning cadence and timing, Nick. How is funding handled within CoverMyMeds as far as, do they allocate like product funding to basically like you as the director of product manager to allocate the individual products? Do they allocate it like on an annual basis to each product? Or do you actually have to like create business cases and go to some sort of group at CoverMyMeds? And I guess the way that it works at CoverMyMeds, do you think it works well or doesn't work well?
Yeah, I think I guess I do think it works well. I think the question around funding, it's a little, I think it works a little bit different potentially at CoverMyMeds than other places, right? Where in other places you're trying to talk about funding for a very I think it's very product focused. I've got this widget, I've got this much headcount that can go towards that, and can I get that funding this year again or not? I think at CoverMyMeds, a lot of times the funding isn't necessarily for the products themselves. It's more for the business units and the departments. And then the product leaders in that group get to decide based on certain merits and what they kind of value they want to do, where they're putting their bets and their priority in a given time period. And so CoverMyMeds is funding the departments, and the departments are sort of choosing, at least for the established products, which products and are getting how many people, getting what level of focus based on where we need to go. Like, what are those objectives, and which of those products give us the best levers to move us towards those goals for the quarter of the year. For new products and new initiatives, it does come down to trying to make a business case where we say, here's how many people we think we would need to at least start this and find out if there is value. Here's what it's going to cost over the next maybe 3 years. Initial funding plus people, and then making a case to a group of the senior leadership team to say, can we get this, basically unallocated funding this year in order to start on this project, start on this product. And so it does, I think new things take that business case. Older things, again, are more a function of the departments and the business units that own that kind of collection of products.
Okay, thank you. It's interesting to hear. So it sounds like for just your regular product, like optimization type work, you have kind of a set of IT teams that you're working with, and you're just prioritizing from that fixed number of resources what they're going to be working on.
Yeah,
basically.
Yeah,
Okay.
It becomes more a function of what am I willing to say yes and no to versus
Sure.
Do I have dollars and cents for it?
Okay. That's good. I'd love to get to that place on our side too.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Well, I realized that we are now, it is 7:02. So we are past our hour that we have asked for Nick. So everybody, thanks so much, Nick, for coming out and sharing. This has been a great product tank. And, I hope we see everyone at the next one. But Nick, thanks so much for coming out, man.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. This was a lot of fun.